Good morning, church. Good to see you here today. Hope you've had a fantastic weekend. Hope you've got a lot of good that's come out of it. There's a lot of things that are going on in life for the good and for the bad, and struggles and for victories. And we'll go through those together. We'll do it in a way that glorifies and praises the Lord. And glad to have you here today, especially if you're a visitor. I do know we have several people that are visiting because they are coming to town for college, and we want you to know you are welcome here. We'd love to get to know you and hope you can find this is a very good place for you to grow closer to God during your college years. It's a very important thing to do, and to make sure you're very deliberate in that, and it will benefit you greatly. So any way that we can help you, please let us know. We're thankful that you are here. Today we're going to start a new series of lessons, Power of Evil. I know, usually there's some beautiful picture that we put up of a mountainscape or landscapes, or Mike had a great one for his lesson this morning as he opened up his slide. I know sometimes it's a joyous picture. And now I've got this horrific hand up here, something from your nightmares. The power of evil. It's a real thing, evil. Sometimes we characterize it as a thing that we dismiss and put off, but in the Bible, evil is quite real, and it has an effect and an influence on the lives of the people around. We know today the effect and influence of evil is quite striking in our world today. Wayne could not give a better prayer as he opened up with that, noting that there are evil things that happen in our world today. What is the power of evil in our lives? The real power. How do we respond to that? What is lacking in the power of evil? That's the real question. And what are Christians, God's people, what are we determined to do in a godly way in the face of such effect and influences of evil? Romans chapter 12, verse 9, you know I love this passage, Romans chapter 12, because in many ways it describes what a Christian is supposed to be, what our reasonable expectation, what God's expectation is for us to be a Christian. And it begins with, let love be without hypocrisy. Let love be without hypocrisy. First line. Second line, abhor that which is evil. Hold fast to that which is good. Cling to what is good. That's a powerful verse, 3 lines in the midst of it. But it begins with, let love be without hypocrisy. Let there be no pretense, no acting, no falsehood in your love. And this is agape love. This is the highest form of good love, where you are looking out for what's best for the person that you do love. Up until this point in the book of Romans, that agape has primarily been used to describe God's love for us, God's love for what's best for us. And here he's challenging the Christians to take that love that God defines and demonstrates for us, and now we take that and we give that out into the world around us. It's our responsibility. Let love be without hypocrisy. Let there be no pretense, no falsehood in your love. Let it be in reality. Whatever we do as a Christian, let it be driven by love. That's the truth of who we are in our identity. But because of love, our effect and our influence, well, that'll make it godly if it matches up with what is godly in the Bible. But he follows that quite harshly and in this striking contrast immediately with abhor that which is evil. That word that he uses there for abhor, it's the only time it's used in the scriptures, I do believe, and it's a strong word. It's a strong word. It might even be stronger than hate, detest, have no room for. That influence and effect of evil in your life. There is a thing he's saying that you should have nothing to do with it. Give it no place in your heart, no place in your mind, and have a reaction to it for sure. Some people say it just be shocked by what's in. That really sells it a little short. Abhor that which is evil. That's not hard to do sometimes with the big things. But we live in a difficult world with that, right? You remember the first time you heard about a school shooting, a mass shooting? Do you remember the first time? Man, that was striking, wasn't it? Second time, still. Third time, still. Fourth time, okay. 23rd time. I don't dislike it any less, the suffering that comes out of it, but it doesn't hit the same way. There's a challenge that comes out of that for it. I was like, wait a minute. There's still very, very evil people with evil intent in the midst of this. The evil people in the midst of that. And there's a challenge in the midst of that. The flip side is what he gives in that next The very last verse of Romans 12, verse 9, if we are to abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Cling to what is good. That doesn't mean just kind of a gentle hold on to it. Maybe not even a firm handshake. You ever do that with someone, give a handshake with someone, and sometimes it's really firm, and then there's those very light ones. We used to call it the dead fish. It's disgusting. I do it on purpose sometimes just to see the reaction because no one likes it. But can you imagine if that's as tightly as you held on to what was good? A gentle little tap. That's kind of vulgar in a way. This is more than that, and this is more than just a firm grip. It's the idea that you are cemented to which is good. You are committed to that which is good. Romans 12:9 is telling us that when we abhor that which is evil, check that, balance that with clinging to what is good. Let that not be separated from your life at all, as defined by God. Let's take that, we'll come back to it, and let's go into the power of evil for a little bit, because make no mistake about it, we are mystified by evil in our culture. And many people are like, no, not me. However, has there ever been a more popular time for true crime? Do you not know greater lists of serial killers than any other people in the history of the world? Yeah. 25%, almost 25% of podcasts are dedicated to true crime. It used to be that when you mentioned certain evil people who had evil influences and evil effects in their lives, serial killers being pretty high up there, they knew a couple. Everyone would probably know John Wayne Gacy, that guy. Everyone would probably know, Ed Gein or a couple others. Now it's to the point where people know these wild ones. The toy box killer, Israel Keys. Why are we talking about those guys? We're fascinated with evil and its effect. And sometimes that comes because there's a fear that's built up within us. And sometimes it's like, how did some people survive? And there's interesting studies on the way that men listen to these kind of podcasts versus women, and who identifies with the victim and how not to be a victim, and who takes up the defense of a situation. But there's a fascination with it for sure. It extends further. I mean, we have our favorite movie villains, don't we? Yours may be Cruella de Vil, not because you want to be Cruella de Vil. I'll start with the Disney and we'll build it up a little bit. You don't want to be Cruella de Vil. And if you do, don't make a coat out of puppies. Don't wear that to church. If you do, we're going to videotape that for sure. But I don't know how soft it might be. Bring me one too. You start with Cruella de Vil. No one wants that. But she's a fascinating and interesting character. And it's a good villain. It's a good villain. Scar in The Lion King. Fascinating villain, a little more complex, fascinating. But you move up at some point, and they're very clearly evil versus good and whatever, even in Star Wars. Darth Vader, I remember as a 5-year-old going, man, I don't know what that guy's all about, but he looks cool. He just moves cool. Fascinated by those things, but he's clearly the bad guy, right? Don't want to be him, but there's a fascination with him. And how did he get that way? Why would he choose to do that? Of course. And eventually Freddy Krueger, and eventually even Slender Man on the newer ones for sure. We're fascinated with these. Even on the TV shows, Law and Orders and SVUs and all those other things that come, the power of evil has this sort of fascination, and it's nothing new. Make sure you understand, it's nothing new. Throughout history, there's always been these fascinations with these things, and books written about it. And when they didn't have the internet and all the things that we had, they wrote poems about very famous murders and songs about them, and it carried on just in a different format. But it tells us that we struggle with the power of evil. We don't want it in our lives, and on some level, we want to understand it. Why do people make these choices? And if it affects my life in some way, how do I protect myself from it? And how do I keep myself out of the real influence and effects of it? Because I don't want that kind of harm and suffering. And brothers and sisters, that's really what it gets down to. When we're talking about evil, we are talking about things that lead to such harm and suffering and pain and corruption and ruin and revenge, and things that as a Christian, we want none of that in our lives. Abhor that which is evil. Don't give it space in your mind to become that or participate in it. Don't give it space in your heart to normalize it and be like, yeah, okay, is it that bad? Or even to have the temptation to justify it. We want none of that in our lives. But even when you think in terms of the power of evil, and it results in, it comes about as a result of selfishness. Selfishness. Pride. It comes as a result of human harm, seeking harm, and suffering. It comes about because of rebellion. It's really at the core of all of it. And when you stop and you start looking at it from that lens, you're like, these are things that could not be in greater opposition to God. They could not be in greater opposition to God. It's deliberate choices. And sometimes, they come about and people didn't plan it, but they happen. But these are choices where people are making in our world today to be rebellious, to be selfish, to cause harm, to cause suffering. And you may be saying, well, he's leading with serial killers and I'm not that, so I might be okay. Well, we might need to examine a little bit further. When you usually ask a kid to name some sins, they usually start with the biggest ones all, which is cute and disturbing all at once. 9-year-old, you ask them, okay, name some sins? Murder. Okay, are you struggling with that? Adultery. What? Those are good answers. And as you mature, you begin to realize there's a lot more nuance to it. And so we can't say, well, at least I'm not murdering, and at least I'm not committing adultery, and at least I'm not these big things, so the power of evil really doesn't impact my lives. But back up a little bit. Let's look at the bigger list of sins and ask yourself, let's get to the results. Am I causing suffering in this world? Am I bringing harm to someone in this world? Even if I think I can justify it, am I contributing to those sort of things? Am I driven by kind of a revenge? If someone harms me, am I looking into a way to get them back and make them pay? Am I trying to bring corruption or ruin to a situation? Those tend to cut a little closer to home. Sometimes even as adults, when I didn't get my way in a situation, boy, I'll get them. That's causing harm. That's bringing suffering. That's an effect. That's an influence. And it's in opposition to God. And it's evil. We want to abhor what is evil. Give it no place in our lives, and no place in our mind, and no place in our heart, which means no place in our actions. And we want to cling to which is good, which means we are submitted and committed to what is godly and good. All right, let's go into some examples in the Bible. And this happens in many times from the effects and influences of humans, but we're going to start with the evil that I think a lot of people still have a bit of a scare, and certainly in this time, it's just mind-boggling to have to deal with these sort of things. And in the Bible, there were certain demon possessions and evil spirits, and they had an effect and influence that was quite direct on people. Now, we don't know what they look like, and just for the sake of it, this one looks kind of disturbing because it reminds me of those scary stories to tell in the dark books that I used to have in elementary school, but whatever. The question is, how will it affect us? Well, they asked that question in the first century because in some sense, the effect of evil will go into your ears and it'll go into your eyes and it'll go into your mouth. But I'd like for us to think about it also in the sense of what comes out of our mouths and what do we project through our eyes and what effects do we give because of what we hear into this world, and how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect ourselves? There was a story in Mark chapter 9. We're going to stay in Mark. So if you want to go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 9, of a boy who had an unclean spirit in him. And Jesus was called to that situation, and they needed a solution. The effect of the unclean spirit was quite vile. It was harmful. It was bringing suffering, not just to the boy, but to his father, and not just to his father, but the community, which reminds us that these things tend to have a ripple effect in them at all. The effect and influence of evil runs deep. It typically isn't just the individual, especially in such a way that was so harmful to children. Jesus is going out, and there's a crowd of people that's gathered, and we'll begin in verse 16, and his disciples are with these people, and he says, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd in verse 17 said, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples, and they should cast it out, but they could not." And Jesus said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." So they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus says, "Well, how long has this been happening to him?" And the father says, "From childhood. Often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Do you see the amount of suffering that's happening at this point? Can you imagine, parents, that there's this thing that's affecting your children and you have no control over it and it's bringing incredible harm to them? What I love in this story is in going to Jesus, he's asking for compassion. He's asking for a godly answer. He's not asking to cause more suffering. He's not asking for more harm. His response to this is, can you have compassion on us? I'm coming to you as the Son of God for godly answers. He's not trying to solve it by bringing more chaos and more evil into the midst of it. He's asking for compassion. That's a good lesson and a good thing for us to remember in the face of it, because the truth is evil has no power when godliness is in effect. And Jesus is going to prove this. It may appear that way at times, but it does not. God has the power. God has the power. And Jesus says, if you can believe, all things are possible with him who believes. And immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Wow. Father, whatever I'm lacking, please help me get to that point. Do you see his desire for God in the midst of this? He wasn't being led by the evil. He was being led towards God in the midst of this. And Jesus saw the people came running together. He rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. And the spirit cried out, and it convulsed him greatly, and it came out of him. And he became as one of the dead, and many said he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And isn't that what Jesus does? Lifts us up. Takes us to a place we couldn't on our own at times. And there's an incredible effect that also rippled throughout the community. They saw what Jesus had done. They saw what godliness was doing, and it had a great influence and effect on them as well. That's the power of God. But it's not the only time a situation like this unfolded. There was a story in Mark chapter 9 in which there was a man who was possessed by an evil spirit, a demon, many of them, called Legion. And he went through incredible amounts of suffering. And Jesus came onto the situation and he had compassion on him. He had compassion on him. And the spirit said, what do we have to do with you, Jesus? Don't torment us. Throw us into the swine. And Jesus did that. But this was a time in which Jesus told the man, once he cast them out into the swine, and this is in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, if you want to read that. We don't have time to read through all of them, so I'll give you that for your notes. Jesus had compassion, and the people saw what was happening, and some of them freaked out and wanted Jesus to leave, but he told the guy, go and tell what God has done for you. And there's that effect and influence of godliness in the midst of it, which tells us the power of evil has limitations. Both these stories, it has limitations. And it is not greater than the power of God. Interesting. Mary Magdalene, a significant character in the New Testament. Many interesting things about her, but Mark 16 verse 9 tells us it was out of her. Jesus cast several unclean spirits out of her, demons out of her. Now, when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. There was a personal thing that was taking place here, but Jesus was transforming lives. And her response to this was not to move towards the effect and influence of evil, but she became a devoted follower of God in the midst of it. Again, limitations of the power of evil. I keep bringing up the limitations of the power of evil and showing where it fails and how it can be overcome, because sometimes we allow it to get so big in our heads that we think what can stop it. And we allow it to grip us, and we allow it to affect us, not in ways that we necessarily intend, but we allow it to limit us because we say, what can we do against such greater forces, against such darkness, against these fears and these doubts and these things that kind of weigh down on top of us? And make no mistake about it, we have many of those things in our world that would tempt us to follow after that effect and influence. But the scripture reminds us we don't have to do that. We don't have to fall into that trap. Yeah, concern? Absolutely. Absolutely. To use wisdom in a world that has wickedness in it? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. To be deeply bothered? Yes, absolutely. To abhor the evil? Yes, absolutely. But we're not boxed in. We're not on the retreat. We're not defensive. We're not huddled into our buildings, because we are God's people. And our God is greater than any evil. Let that be what drives us in this world. Our God is greater than any power of evil. Any power of evil. I tell that sometimes to young people, and I tell it sometimes to older people because they get so deeply concerned. And I just remind them, and we need that reminder from time to time, no matter how dark it looks, your God is greater and brighter and more powerful. The power of evil is very limited. We see this even in the story in Mark 1. You think about that in Mark 1? This is one of the first things, the very beginning of the book of Mark. Mark's beginning by telling us this account of a situation where a man is in a synagogue and he has an unclean spirit. Mark is opening up, not necessarily in the traditional way you would see with Matthew and other ones, but Mark is getting right to the business of it. And yes, he goes through the baptism of Jesus, but he starts with John the Baptism preparing the way. He gets a few disciples, and then he gets straight to this. In the first chapter of Mark, he's wanting to establish this power of God over the things that we may fear or may lead us to doubt. The power of Jesus to handle the situation. That early in the book. He's getting right to the point. Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And there was a man in the synagogue, and he had an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "Let us alone. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him. Two things. He just said two things. Be quiet and come out of him. Man, that's power. That is power. This whole passage here Mark's putting in because it is the authority of Jesus. You get a little bit of the foreshadowing of it when it gives you the hint. He taught as one with authority, not as the scribes. So he's setting Jesus apart, not just as a teacher, but here as a divine being who has authority even over top of these evil spirits, by which man has no power in and of himself, but God does. God does. And quite casually, he says just two commands. Be quiet and come out of him. We don't know how he said it. Be quiet, come out of him. In a peaceful sort of way, or it might have been much, much stronger. Don't know. But we do know that the unclean spirit, it convulsed the man and it came out of him. It had no power. It could not resist God. And the people were like, what is happening here? What is happening here? We have another account where the devil himself comes to tempt Jesus. And you can read about this in a couple of passages in the Gospels. But the devil himself comes to tempt Jesus. And not even he could prevent Jesus from doing what he needed to do. And the interesting thing in this passage is that Jesus does not use his divine powers in the way he had in this and the other miracles. But what I think is significant for us to remember, he simply rebuked him by using scriptures. And he simply rebuked him, still, be quiet and end what you're doing here, by quoting the scriptures and by standing fast in his purpose and knowing who he is. And the devil failed. Which means the power of evil failed in this encounter. And that's an important thing for us to remember as well. The limitations of the power of evil, the need for godliness and compassion, but also seeing the possibility of how we can face the power of evil. When we go to truth and we remain steadfast, we are doing right. And when we do it in a godly way, that is a greater power than the power of evil. But it requires us to take action. There is action involved in the midst of this. It is not being passive. It is not huddling together, hiding away. It is taking action. And the devil left in this instance. No, he wouldn't stop, but neither would Jesus. Neither would Jesus all the way to the cross. And we know that people have an interest in the power of evil because there's many of the stories in the Bible that I do show old paintings and stuff that from history, and I do it because one, I love them, and two, I love some of the visuals, and three, a lot of the variety. Some of the stories are really, really hard to find pictures of. And some of them, man, it's easy. Jesus tempted by Satan, super easy. Jesus casting out demons, super easy. Because historically there's been this interest in the power of evil. But in all of these images, in these stories, it's the victory that's found in Jesus, the limitations of evil, and how godliness always wins out. And the power of those stories is the reminder that good will win. that there is victory in God. And that means that psychologically for us, the question isn't so much how do I necessarily protect myself? Yes, of course, but also how do I stand against it? Not for somebody else to do that, but in my own life. How do I stand against it and take responsibility to say, yeah, I'm a child of God, and I know God's power is at work, and yes, God's truth is at work, and that's what I'm going to speak in the world, and that's what I'm going to contribute. And when I see godliness going out into the world, can I contribute to it? Can I be a part of it? And it doesn't have to be anything too complicated. This weekend, there were several people that were, I appreciate everything that was done. There was a move that took place, and so many people came in, and what a crew of people that just gave of their time and their effort and their sweat. And then I know that some of those people went on to help other people that yesterday. And I know some of the other people went on and did other good deeds for people that day. And there was a quote, I'll quote Sarah. She's like, isn't it good to be around these kinds of people? That's a paraphrase. I don't remember your exact quote, but I think I'm okay in the ballpark. Isn't it good to be around these kinds of people? Yeah, it absolutely is. Because it's people that's not looking to hurt and harm and backtalk and bring suffering. It's people that are looking to bring goodness. It's people willing to contribute. I'm sure more happened than very much more than what I'm aware of. There's things that you're probably thinking about. Yeah. I know somebody that did something really good yesterday, and I know people that contributed yesterday, and I know people that gave more to it. You probably do. It may have been you, and I appreciate that in you. There may be in a moment where you were tempted to get revenge or bring suffering or cause gossip or whatever, but you didn't. Man, I'm so grateful for that kind of thing. That's the effect and influence of evil. We should want nothing to do. And when it even comes our way, we need to stand up and say, I'm not going to participate. Even if someone else brings it towards us. No, thank you. I will not participate in that. Let's bring good. Let's bring love. Let's bring care. The power of evil is always greatly weakened when the power of good steps into the forefront and says, this is how life is supposed to be. Evil does not dictate our world. It thinks it does. But our God is the God of all. And our Jesus, he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and that's over all the kingdoms and all the nations and all the worlds and planets and all that exists. We live for him. Let's hold and cling to that, and let that motivate you through the week. So you can continue saying, what good can I do? What good can I do? How do I demonstrate love? And when I see someone just asking for compassion, let me give it. Let me give it to them. Let me be like Jesus. And where I'm weak, let me pray to Jesus to help in my unbelief. And where I'm weak and can't do everything on my own, let me remember that there's a whole congregation of people and Christians out in the world and people that want to do good, and let me lean on them as well. You are never alone in that. So let's go through this life together. The power of evil? Sure. There is some power in evil. It never leads to anywhere good. It's ultimately destructive. But there's always true power in God. Don't forget that. That's our encouragement for the week. Let people see God in you. All right, we'll conclude with an invitation. Today, this week, it's been a great blessing. I've got to meet several people that I haven't met before. I hope you get to meet some people as they leave. If you haven't met someone that's a visitor or they're not so familiar, or you haven't talked to someone in a while, just reconnect with them. But before we get to that point, we want to offer the invitation. And that's this, that if you are not in the relationship you need to be with God, you need to do something about it. I'm not saying that to condemn you or to beat you down or push you away. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm saying it doesn't have to be that way. And then there's an answer. There's a way for you to come to God. There's a way for you to obey the gospel. There's a way for you to have forgiveness. It may be that you've allowed some of these effects of evil to kind of dominate your life. You need to do something about that. If you've been bringing suffering and harm to people, if you've been caught up in some mix of that, please repent of that. And maybe that's something you take care of privately, but maybe it's really heavy and it's created a habit and a lifestyle and you can't just shake it and you need the prayers of the church. Please let us know. Please let us know. You don't have to be caught in that kind of a power. God's power, Christ's power is in forgiveness and love and salvation and in truth, and that is exactly what we want to do to help you. If you need salvation, if you need prayers, if you need care, please let us know. Right now, as we stand and as we sing.